Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our last webinar of the year, Turnkey SpendMend Pharmacies webinar. We spent all year kind of going through the things to do to make sure that you are always HRSA audit ready regarding the compliance of your 340B program. And what we would like to do today is be able to take all of that and turn our attention a little bit to how to optimize or maximize your 340B program to ensure that you have the resources you need to be able to support your compliance efforts. Your hosts today are myself, Chelsea Violet, and my counterpart, Matt Parker. We're both directors of optimization here for SpendMend Pharmacy. And we've already gotten our first question about if we'll be sharing the slides after the webinar, or if you need to take screenshots. We will be sending out the slides and a recording of the webinar over the next couple of days, so you do not need to take screenshots. You will have that sent to you. And with that, I'd like to go to our first slide where we'll just take a quick poll to see who is in the room. So we're just trying to get an idea of what types of covered entities or organizations you're all joining us from. And if you can go ahead and select the answer that most ties to your organization or your covered entity type, that would be wonderful. We've got about 3/4 of people responding. We'll give it just a couple more seconds. All right, and let's see. We've got almost 2/3 of our attendees are from hospitals subject to the GPO prohibition. So your disproportionate share hospitals, your pediatric hospitals and cancer hospitals. We've got about 15% each of hospitals subject to the orphan drug exclusion, such as RRCs, CAUSE, or Soul Community hospitals. And then another 15% of federally qualified health centers or lookalike grantees. And a very small portion of non-CHC grantees, and then some that fall under the category of other. Thank you so much for taking the time to do that. We look forward to spending the next hour with you and hope this is helpful for all of you.
All right, thank you, Chelsea.
Matt, I believe we are really zoomed in on your screen. I see a very small part of your slide.
Okay. How about now?
Still just seeing a portion of the slide. It worked fine until the poll. Perhaps stop sharing and then reshare. Sorry guys, hang in there with us for just a moment. So the window that you just dragged over only showed that part of the screen, and now we have the whole slide. Oh, now it's gone. There it is. All right, I think you're good to go, Matt.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, excuse the technical issues there. Chelsea, thank you for kicking us off. I do want to start with just a quote to get us going today. And this is a quote that Chelsea and I hear many times working with colleagues like yourself that run 340B programs, is that I'm just too busy trying to ensure the compliance of my program. I don't have time to look at opportunities to optimize and grow my program. And through our presentation today, we want to hopefully bring to your eyes the fact that really you're doing some of the work already that needs to be done to do optimization and growth and through your compliance work. And actually there's a lot of synergy that can be had by doing optimization and compliance at the same time to help build out and round out your program. We like to refer to these as a coin, if you will. The 340B coin, on one side is compliance, on the other side is optimization and growth. And so as you're doing your compliance work, you're worried about your compliance risk. You're looking at ineligible prescribers that are qualifying. You're looking at ineligible locations. You're looking at mismapped NDCs, missing purchasing data, purchases outside the accumulator. And your targets for those are prescribers, locations, and accumulation outliers. All of that data can actually reveal opportunities to you on the optimization and growth side. So you can see from ineligible prescribers, there's the possibility of finding filters that are inappropriately applied, or some missing data that can be gained and bring in additional utilization. From ineligible locations, obviously you have possible missing or unnecessary filters, missing data utilization. And then for your mismapping, of course, there could be potential there. Ultimately, what we believe is that the dollars that you can achieve from optimizing and growing your program, you can actually pull those back into the 340B program and help build your resources to help further your compliance and your program. I've never met a pharmacy leader that didn't have a couple extra FTEs on their pharmacy wish list. And optimizing of your program can allow the financial resources to support program growth, to get those extra staff members in there, and hopefully give you a little bit of bandwidth to continue managing your program. Chelsea?
So that's all great and dandy, but what we hear a lot after kind of going through that information is, holy cow, this sounds very kind of abstract or nebulous. Where do I even start? What type of information would I even need? So kind of going along with what Matt had said, you're really looking at a lot of this information already. So start with what you already have. When you're doing your compliance monitoring and auditing, you're looking at your purchasing data and your utilization data. All of your purchasing accounts, and then your accumulator data for your mixed use accounts, your administration data for any clean sites you may have, and any e-prescription and qualified prescription data for your retail accounts, whether coming out of your health record or through your TPA or vendor. Looking at that information and matching it up in different ways, you can identify anomalies or mismatched data between that information, which again, as Matt said, might point you in the direction of some compliance concerns, but very well could reveal some untapped opportunities. All right, so that's great and dandy too. What types of anomalies should I be looking for when comparing this information? So the list of things you could identify is pretty endless, but we've tried to boil it down to a handful of examples that we see most often and that we'll walk through today. So probably one of the most common is kind of falls under the umbrella of incorrect package multipliers, incorrect mapping between NDCs and CDMs, preferred NDC selection within a medical record, and mapping within utilization data. We also see for hospitals that are subject to the GPO prohibition, we see NCODs being purchased exclusively on a WAC account, where based on the definitions set forth within policy, they could be purchased on a less expensive price point on a GPO account. Similarly, with hospitals subject to the orphan drug exclusion, we see hospitals not leveraging the voluntary 340B-like pricing that's available for some drugs. We see several entities, again, not purchasing covered outpatient drugs on a 340B account when they are not subject to the GPO prohibition. So those smaller hospitals and clinics and grantees, they can kind of select which drugs they'd like to have on their 340B formulary. We see some uncaptured waste, both in the 340B and GPO realm. We see some missing pharmacy retail claims and incorrect 340B or sub-WAC pricing catalog loads, as well as inconsistent pricing across entities within the same health system. And we are going to dig into some concrete examples of some of these to kind of show you what those look like. All right, so looking at our 340B specific opportunities. Over to you, Matt.
Yes. So one of the first things that we can consider, this maybe even low-hanging fruit, if you will, if you're going through your data, is looking for package multipliers and CDM mapping issues. Obviously, as we've stated, that's already something you're probably doing as part of some of your compliance checks as you're reviewing data. Maybe you have queues that are built into your TPA that kind of bring unmapped NDCs or CDMs to light. But we'd encourage you to go through those and have someone responsible for doing that, because there are dollars on the table when you're talking about mismatches. I've got a couple here that I want to bring to your attention. These are actually live examples from clients that we've worked with. Up top, the first one we have is Spiriva. Spiriva, as we pulled the data into Excel, I know many of you are probably exporting data, moving it into Excel so that you can use it better from your TPA. One of the things that kind of highlighted out to us is that Spiriva typically dispenses a whole unit unless we're doing some type of common canister type operation, but we see accumulations that are partial of 1.1. And then looking over at the GPO accumulations, again, a partial accumulation. That's kind of a red flag there to say, well, based off my operations, I always know I'm dispensing each or one unit for this particular product. Maybe I need to dig in and see why I have these partial utilizations going on. And then the final red flag that we noticed was, look at the WAC purchases over here. Majority of the purchases were going to WAC in this particular instance. As we dive in deep, ultimately what we found is that there was a BUPP issue. That's a macrohelix specific term, but it's a multiplier issue. The client had this built as a BUPP of 10, and in reality, it needed to be a BUPP of 1, meaning one package represented one billable unit. And once we were able to make that change, the savings that the customer was able to experience is $22,000. Now, that in total took probably, just a couple minutes of time of digging and trying to understand what's going on with the information, but you can see that it brought a good deal of savings. And I don't think any pharmacy leader, again, would walk away from $22,000. We're all trying to find as much savings as we possibly can during these tough financial times. Dropping down to mismapped NDCs, another example here, product Mvazi. So one of the newer products on the market. You have to be careful as new products come on the market, whether it's new NDCs or new products altogether, biosimilars being the case here. This particular one, the CDM was not mapped, and so we saw all purchases going over to WAC, so no accumulations coming through, no purchases coming through for GPO or 340B. And so digging in deep, ultimately we found that there was a CDM that was actually created for this particular product, but for some reason it had been excluded in the crosswalk. And so we were able to go back in and map that together, that CDM to NDC, and as a result, estimated savings about $13,000. So again, low-hanging fruit that's available there. Just take some time to really review the data, dig in deep, and find where the problem is.
All right, so kind of continuing in the same vein, oops, go back one, please. Thank you. Continuing in the same vein, looking at things that maybe aren't mapped correctly or we're missing some utilization, you can see in the top example here, we had an NDC that was discontinued. Manufacturer had updated their product and changed the NDC. It's still a 9-digit NDC match. The client here in this case had not purchased up kind of the remaining accumulations when that previous product was discontinued because there was no more to purchase. So they had started purchasing the new NDC that was available, with a lot of those purchases going to GPO. This is a hospital that was not subject to GPO prohibition, as you can see. But all of those purchases going to GPO, well, they still had a lot of 340B accumulations available on the discontinued NDC, where this product is the same product with a 9-digit NDC match, and it is the same manufacturer, and the client had wording or verbiage in their policy that said that they match to an 11-digit NDC whenever possible, with the exception of some outstanding circumstances, and this falls under that category. So they were able to reallocate those 10.9 packages you can see under the sum of 340B accumulation to their new NDC, which ultimately saved them about $50,000 in purchasing those almost 11 packages on 340B instead of GPO. Looking at the example on the bottom, you can see that we had purchased a large number of vials of albumin, the 100 ml vials, on WAC, so 271 vials with no 340B accumulations or purchases, no GPO accumulations, and then 17 GPO purchases. This doesn't look quite right. We're quite sure what was causing this kind of mismapping or mismatch in data. Drilled down into it, and we're able to identify that the inner NDC of this package, I know the inner and outer NDCs are a headache for many covered entities, particularly when looking at NDC mapping. But this inner NDC was actually mapped to the 50 ml vial instead of the 100 ml vial. So every time the 100 ml vial was used, it was creating a 50 ml vial accumulation, which was never being used. And then the 100 ml vials needed to continue to be purchased on WAC. So being able to remap that, gain back those previous accumulations, and purchase it on 340B moving forward. And our next slide is another way to look at some of the same information. So we're looking at a lot of things that have both utilization and purchasing information, but don't necessarily match up one for one. And in this instance, we're looking for NDCs that had utilization coming through the medical record, however, did not have any purchases. And then vice versa, NDCs that were purchased, but we had no record of ever being administered. Looking at this type of information can also help drill down into mismapped NDCs or CDMs or some missing utilization data. And on to our next slide. So here's where we get into our hospital-specific challenges. So for those hospitals subject to the non-covered outpatient drug rule, or excuse me, the GPO prohibition, looking at non-covered outpatient drugs is really important. Not that it's not important for all entities, but becomes really important for those entities because you want to be able to leverage as much savings as you can without putting yourself at risk of a GPO prohibition violation. So with that said, we saw Elsis, which is a product used to make TPNs, came out similar to the example we looked at before. One NDC was discontinued, a new NDC came out. And in this particular situation, we saw, again, no accumulation or purchases being made on our 340B or GPO accounts, with many being made on WAC accounts. So digging down into it, identifying that it did align with the non-covered outpatient drug definition or the covered outpatient drug exclusions entity had outlined within policy, being able to designate this as a GPO-only drug within their splitter so that that was purchased exclusively on the GPO account. As you can see, the price differential between the two products is not a massive difference, but because it is such a high volume drug, it does generate a fair amount of savings for the entity at the end. And looking at our orphan drug exclusions, some manufacturers provide voluntary 340B-like pricing for entities subject to the orphan drug exclusion. Unfortunately, the example we put in here is for Remicade, and that opportunity is going away at the end of December. But the theory and topic still holds true for those other products that have voluntary pricing available. So looking through utilization and GPO purchase history for an organization, identifying that a large number of vials of Remicade were being purchased on a GPO account, and we knew that there was voluntary 340B-like pricing for that. So switching that over from being a blocked item for the covered entity and maintaining the documentation on hand that at the time J&J was offering voluntary 340B-like pricing, able to generate a fair amount of savings for that covered entity as well. And looking at our 340B formulary, so this is, as I said, looking at those smaller hospitals that are not subject to the GPO prohibition, or our clinics such as FQHCs and other grantees. So you can identify which products you want to be purchasing on a 340B account. For this particular covered entity, it was a critical access hospital, and what we did was look at their GPO purchases over a year that resulted in more than $10,000 being spent on one product, just as a place to start. With looking at all of those, we obviously found a lot of orphan drugs that do not have voluntary 340B-like pricing, which is unfortunate, but being able to drill down into drugs that do have 340B pricing and could potentially create some benefit for the organization to purchase on 340B. Whether or not an organization carbs in Medicaid could determine whether a patient or the hospital clinic needs to purchase on both a 340B and the GPO account, this could be going through an accumulator, or it could be done manually through kind of a self-accumulation process. So this particular client was actually running their own accumulator, which is important for folks to know that depending on the size and scale of your program, a big, massive, kind of all the bells and whistles TPA isn't really necessary depending on what your program looks like. So you can kind of pick and choose whether you carve in or carve out which products make sense for you as an organization to purchase on a 340B account. Over to you, Matt.
All right, perfect. So let's talk about drug waste for just a moment here. So drug waste is a potential opportunity, and the message of this slide is really to make sure that you're looking at drug waste from both a 340B standpoint and a GPO standpoint, particularly for those hospitals that have a GPO prohibition there as part of that exclusion. And so the example that I have for you is the cadcycline. Again, kind of the same red flags that we saw in one of the earlier examples that I used. We see a partial accumulation coming over. 160 is a single dose vial, so we'd expect there to be whole accumulations coming through the dose administered plus the JW waste coming through for that. We see no 340B purchases, and then we see purchases coming over to WAC. And so this is a very easy way for us to identify that we've got some leakage here. Now, ideally, what we'd like to do is to make sure that we get on the phone with our billing team, make sure that we have a JW modifier that's firing appropriately, or a workflow that we're able to capture that waste. Sometimes it has to be after the fact via report, but we want to make sure that that waste is being documented. Anytime that you find waste that hasn't been appropriately documented in your EMR and coming into your TPA, you can go through the exercise of creating a waste report, making sure it's an auditable record, and then making that adjustment in your TPA and then saving that file for in the event that HRSA comes knocking at your door, so that you can pull out and have justification for the transactions that you made. And so that's what we did in this case. For this particular client, they had an issue with being able to get waste to bill appropriately. And so we were able to calculate that, hey, there's actually about 3.1 packages of waste that you did not capture. Luckily, we caught it very early for this particular product. And that was able to bring savings of just under $4.5 or just over $5.5 thousand. From a GPO perspective, again, please don't think that waste only impacts on the 340B side. You always want to be looking to see if that waste also occurs on the GPO side. In this case, you've got a fairly large delta between the WAC price and the GPO price. So calculating that waste produces a good bit of savings and making sure that you're getting that loaded back in there. Can't stress enough, though, whenever we're doing this, we're making sure that we create that paper trail, that audible record. That is the requirement that HRSA is going to look for when they come knocking at the door, and they're going to see that documentation to support the transaction that you have there in your TPA. Chelsea? And
I actually am going to jump in there, Matt, just because we got a question that ties right into what you just said. So we got a question about for those waste documentation purposes, how long should you keep auditable records for? And I think at that point, you really want to go back to your personal policies and procedures, because we could tell you anything, but if you have something else written in your policy about how long you maintain auditable records for, or if your organization has a different policy for how long auditable records are maintained, you don't want to be out of compliance with those. So as long as you are following your policies and procedures, you should be in good shape.
That's a great point. All right, Chelsea, I believe this is your slide.
Yes, sorry, I was clicking out of the questions. All right, so along with drug waste, one of the things that we hear clients ask about frequently is, what about inventory drug waste? What about our expired drugs? So here is an example of how you could recapture or recoup accumulations based on your expired drugs. And this may look familiar to you. This actually was one of the articles in our newsletters this year. So essentially what you do is, again, this is all about maintaining auditable records, but for a specific NDC that you're getting reports back from your reverse wholesaler for, or excuse me, for a specific NDC from your wholesaler, you're looking at the purchase history over whatever the designated time period is, and you would define this internally. For the purposes of this example, we're looking at the last quarter. So if for this NDC over the last quarter, about 30% of your purchases have been 340B, 60% have been GPO, and 10% have been WAC, we can look at the same NDC, now looking at the reports from your reverse wholesaler, and look at how many total packages you have expired. So in this example, we have 4 packages. Taking the percentages of your purchases, which are reflective of your utilization, because remember your utilization results in accumulations, which then lead to your purchases. So this ties back directly to your utilization in each of these arenas. So of these 4 packages, 30% can be added back into the 340B accumulator, 60% can be added back into the GPO accumulator. You'd then maintain the documentation of this process as your auditable records and refer to it when you make that manual adjustment to your accumulator. All right, and next slide, please. Looking at retail claim capture. So some covered entities only use in-house or entity-owned retail pharmacies. Some use contract pharmacies, regardless, or some use no retail pharmacies, regardless of what your process is. If you're using retail pharmacies, it's good to look and make sure that things aren't slipping through the cracks and you're not seepage there. So one of the easiest things that we found to do is to go and review fill numbers and note any skips. Identify any potentially missed fills for manual qualification. This could be due to kind of a hiccup with the operations of an accumulator, could be due to something funky that happened at the pharmacy that day. It could also indicate a potential compliance concern if you had gone in and manually disqualified, in this example, fill 2, because you had identified that it wasn't associated with your provider or your location, and it didn't disqualify all fills. It only disqualified that single fill. So important to look at for optimization purposes or opportunities, but also possibly for compliance concerns as well. Our second example, EHR eScript report excluding qualified claims. So you'd start with your electronic prescription record out of your medical record, and then look at all of your qualified claims from the pharmacies you're capturing from, so your in-house or contracts, or possibly both, and review all of the claims that are being prescribed from your covered entity that aren't getting captured. Are they going to those pharmacies and just not catching through the filters that you have? Are there prescribers or locations that are being inadvertently excluded? Additionally, are there retail pharmacies receiving electronic prescriptions that warrant evaluation for contracting with? Are they getting a large portion of your e-prescriptions? Lastly, looking at your non-qualified claim report. So if you're using a TPA and it provides a report to you for all of the claims that were reviewed but not qualified as 340B eligible, you can utilize that and compare it to the electronic prescription report from your health record to identify any prescriptions that weren't captured, that were filled at that pharmacy that potentially should have. We've seen this tied to sometimes misspelled names or a missing MRN or something like that. So things that have slipped through the cracks that way. And with that, Matt, it is all you for overall pharmacy spend opportunities.
Perfect. Yes, we're going to transition our conversation slightly away from pure 340B optimization and really talk about some broader spend optimization or best practices, if you will, and kind of pharmacy supply chain practices that we would like to share with you. One of the first things that you want to be doing or may want to take a look at is 340B pricing and monitoring your invoices that you're receiving from your wholesaler and third-party trading partners, and that you're receiving the appropriate 340B price. Now, this may come to a shock to you, but there are sometimes where mistakes happen and that 340B price falls off inappropriately. Give you an example that we have here for you. Covered entity A was buying this specialty drug. You can see where the 340B price was right around $4,800. And then for a period of 3 or 4 purchases here, we have that price falling off. And actually it went up to the higher WAC price of 14,700. Now that's a large increase and actually has a fairly significant financial impact for this covered entity. If you're not checking your invoices and screening for these type of errors, many times this would just go right to your AP department. It would be paid and you may never know about it. So we like to have safeguards in place where there is a process by which we're checking these invoices, making sure that the appropriate price lands on there. And so that's for 340B, but you also need to look at this from a WAC perspective as well. And again, this may come as a surprise to you that you need to check your WAC pricing, but there can be variances that happen and errors that occur in WAC pricing as well. The example that I give for you is this particular IDN. So they had multiple covered entities. And we're looking at two covered entities here, covered entity A and covered entity B. And they're both purchasing the same generic product. And as you come across, they're both on the WAC account. But you can see that covered entity A doesn't have the sub-WAC contract loaded, whereas covered entity B does. And a difference in pricing there of about $60 between the two. And so what we would recommend is if you're managing, of course, health systems or IDNs, you have multiple pharmacies, you have multiple covered entities, being sure that you're checking to make sure that those prices are loaded appropriately. And you may say, well, how exactly do I do that? One quick thing that you can do is just make sure that if you're a member of Apexis and you're getting sub-WAC contracts through the Prime Vendor Program, going on and making sure that each entity is appropriately registered with Apexis, and each entity has their identity set with Apexis, and then that information should flow appropriately over to the wholesaler. In the event that it's set up appropriately and it just seems like this contract isn't applied, then obviously we would want to work through the wholesaler to make sure that this is credit and rebuild and that the appropriate contract gets applied to that. In addition to checking our different account types, GPO accounts, same problem happens there. And actually more problems can occur in the GPO account just because there are various contracts that get loaded into these accounts. You have your GPO accounts, you have individual agreements. Sometimes you have regional GPOs or collaborative buying groups that are layering pricing on. And so it creates a lot of moving parts, if you will, for these prices to be appropriately loaded to the wholesaler. In this case, again, we've got an IDN here looking at two covered entities, and we have oral contrast agent. Covered entity A has the contract loaded. Covered entity B is on the same contract, but for whatever reason, that contract has not been loaded and did not come through. And so you see the difference there in price. So we would recommend that you're going through and screening for these pricing issues. And again, just in this slide here, you can see where that would add up quite quickly, the difference in price. And this was just a snapshot of the issue. It happened for a longer period of time. Now, as we've been explaining some of these things, and you may be saying to yourself, well, should I really be doing these analyses? Is this stuff that I really need to be doing? And the answer is a resounding yes. We have a couple questions that we'd like for you to answer. Do you purchase pharmaceuticals at 340B pricing? Do you purchase pharmaceuticals for a wholesaler or a third-party trading partner? Do you have a network of pharmacies? If you can answer yes to any of those questions, and that should be everyone that's on the call based off of the survey that we did at the beginning, then these analyses are analyses that you need to have scheduled and ready to go in your program. With that being said, the question then becomes, well, how often do I need to do these? Well, for the pricing analyses, the ones that I just went through, checking your GPO price, checking your WAC, checking your 340B, it's really imperative that that check happens on a monthly basis. And the reason why is the older that a pricing issue or a contract discrepancy is, the harder it is and the less likely it will be that we'll be able to get that corrected and get that appropriate price brought forward to you. A lot of the manufacturers have contracts, of course, with the wholesalers regarding what windows credit and rebills can be ran in. And so you want to be checking those quickly so that you have enough time to get them fixed. And unfortunately, that fix with a wholesaler oftentimes is not a very quick fix. And so even if you're doing a monthly review, it may take several weeks in order for that credit rebill to go through. So you want to give yourself as much time in that window to get that price changed. And then for the utilization versus purchase analysis, some of the earlier things that we were going through, it's really entity specific. And so we would recommend somewhere between monthly and quarterly for the larger dish and RRC folks who are on the phone, who manage your inventory through a virtual inventory through a TPA. We really recommend that those checks be happening on a monthly basis. You're probably already, again, reviewing some of this data as part of your compliance work on a monthly basis. So we would say just add in that financial lens and look a little bit deeper to see if you can come up with a financial win in the process of doing your compliance work. For smaller critical access hospitals and our grantee sites with lower purchase volumes, you probably can get away with doing this on a quarterly basis, or maybe go to a bi-monthly basis, stretch that out a little bit. But nonetheless, very important, regardless of your entity type and your size. These are important things to be working on, and they definitely can bring a benefit to your bottom line. Chelsea?
All right, so I know that kind of broken down into each of these scenarios, it looks very clear. We've highlighted kind of where the anomalies are, what stands out. But this is the result of going through, hundreds of thousands of lines of data, which certainly you can tackle on your own, particularly where you're going through a lot of that information. But we really we specialize in sifting through all that dark data, as that's referred to, and be able to bring those opportunities to light. So in the event that you're looking to explore some of these opportunities and you'd like to reach out to us, potentially work with us, see if we can help you sift through some of that data, we wanted to just touch quickly upon what it looks like to work with us, because that's a question that we get a lot from covered entities when talking about this. So one of the first things that we wanted to show you is that, as I said, we're able to dig down into that dark data and take all of your purchasing accounts and utilization information and generate something that looks like this. We're almost to the point where this will be client facing so that we can share that information back to clients and make that visible. This is kind of what we've been working on the inside, turning what we sift through in all the Excel documents into something that is more visually presentable to C-suites and things like that. But really the point here is that this is kind of sifting through the dark data is our specialty, and we've got the analytics tools to be able to do it much more quickly than you might be able to otherwise. And after that, the next question is, okay, so if you sift through all our data, what happens? What do I have to do all the work? Do you just kind of tell me what's wrong and I fix it? And at the end of the day, we're really here to be your partner when we work with covered entities. So we go through and find all of the types of anomalies that we worked through today, and we set up a meeting and say, here are the things that we identified. This is an example of a document that we would work through and say, looking at this NDC or this type of product, can we drill down into what's happening? We've gone into your accumulator. This is what we see. This is what we think would fix it. Is this something that you're interested in correcting or going after at this time? Some of the examples that we come up with, folks do want to dig into. Some they've already tried and it isn't the time, or it doesn't work with the organization based on the way that they bill or something like that. And really, we're here to support you through whatever you decide you'd like to push forward on. And then once we decide that there are initiatives that you would like to move forward on, such as the ones in green on this screen, what we do is monthly, after that point, after whatever the fix is has been implemented, we go through your purchases and review your purchases for those affected NDCs. So the reason I'm showing you this is because probably once we have the optimization conversation with clients, the next most common question I hear is, how do you know what to invoice? How do you get paid? And really just trying to create some more transparency around that to make it less of a scary or nebulous idea. So here you can see with one client, 3 of the initiatives we have are with Remicade, Xolair, and zoledronic acid. So each month we go in and report out from the wholesaler each of the purchases that have been made for those NDCs. And as you can see, the Remicade and Xolair were both purchased on a 340B account, and our initiative was to increase purchases on those. However, the zoledronic acid there was purchased on a GPO account, and our initiative was to be able to increase 340B purchases of the zoledronic acid. So where the initiative we had put in place did not impact the zoledronic acid, you can see kind of on the next line or the next screenshot and the one at the bottom, zoledronic acid is not invoiced at all because there was no savings realized there. And for the other 2, we're looking at how many packages were purchased, what price did you purchase it at, what price would it have been purchased on without making that change, and then once that is all calculated out for the month, then assigning just the percentage that's contracted for that month. And then each initiative, it gets billed for 12 months out from there. And as you can see, the covered entity still has a very significant amount of savings, and there's no payment up front until we find those things and the covered entity actually benefits from those savings. So hoping that sheds a little bit more light onto the process in general, because I know that that's a question we get frequently. And with that, we open it up to questions. So going through these, can you review the slide on how you manage adding estimated waste back to the accumulator? So Matt, if you wouldn't mind going back to our waste.
Yep, so for drug waste, again, kind of the process here, we've identified for, say, CAD-Cycla, that we've got some potential waste. What we would do is want to go and look at all the utilization over the period of time the drug was used, and then calculate up, knowing that each one of these vials should be a single dose vial, what waste was there. And so you can do that very simply by looking at what was administered versus what the total vial is for, in this case 160 milligrams, and you can create what that waste amount was. And once you've done that, you've got that at the MRN level, you've got it at the individual patient row that you're able to see that. You can sum those up, and then with that auditable record, then you can move forward and make the adjustment in your TPA to say we're going to add back in this case, 3.1 packages. Again, can't stress enough, you can't just go in and just add those transactions. You need to have that auditable documentation, auditable record, so that you can back up that transaction. And so you'll want to save that wherever you're saving documents for your program. And again, that way, if HRSA and Bazell come knocking at your door, you're able to pull that out if that happens to be something that gets sampled, and here's the support of why we did what we did.
So we've got a couple more questions around waste, but first, I got another question about if you guys are going to get the slides. So a revisit, we said at the beginning, within the week, you'll get slides and a recording of this webinar. So please feel comfortable with that. All right, so our other waste questions, we have, why would we be able to add expired medication packages back into the accumulator? So if we go to the next slide, so when you have a neutral inventory, the drugs don't have a 340B or a GPO designation once they hit your shelf, but you purchased those based on eligible administrations to either an outpatient for a covered outpatient drug or an inpatient when it comes to GPO. And if those drugs have expired, you didn't really get the benefit of that savings. And where you've already administered the drug to that eligible outpatient or eligible inpatient in the case of GPO, going through and expiring those medications right now, you're not getting any of those back. It's just kind of increasing your WAC exposure, which is okay, because there's certainly a lot of manual maintenance to do in terms of accumulating expired drug waste, and it certainly doesn't make sense for all organizations or all drug products. But for those that it does make sense for, you have already earned those accumulations, again, as I said, either for 340B for eligible outpatients or for eligible inpatients on GPO. And looking back at your utilization by way of your purchases over the last whatever the designated time period is, you can then take those percentages of utilization, kind of use the transitive property, and bring them over to look at what you're expiring, how much of it, and what percentage of that could go back into your accumulator. Okay. What about undocumented waste? If it isn't documented in the EMR, are we able to account for it on our accumulator? Yeah,
so I think that's probably more related to this side. So again, If for some reason you're not able to have that JW modifier fire or your waste documentation coming through your EMR, it is appropriate to maintain that documentation outside your EMR. Not necessarily ideal, but still appropriate. And so you can create that auditable record. It has all the tenets that you would need to have that reviewed by an auditor when they come in to review your program. You'd want to have the patient information, MRN, be able to tie that back to an administration. So you can show where the patient actually got the dose of, say, 100 milligrams and they were wasting 60 milligrams for a total of 160. And as long as you've got those pieces, then that is an appropriate and a compliant way of managing waste.
Does this waste process work with multi-dose vials, or is it best to do it only with single-dose vials?
Yeah. So wasting for multi-dose vials gets very, very tricky. At least doing it in this manner. Chelsea, I don't know if you've done much with it in this manner.
I think that I have not done it personally, but if I were to execute it, I'd use the same logic as the expired drug waste. Look at overall utilization records, and then accumulate back on a percentage basis based on documented utilization.
Yeah, I would agree. I think just from my personal standpoint, it's pretty easy and straightforward for a single dose vial. When you get into the multi-dose vials, it does get a little bit more complicated of where that waste would go, but this kind of allocation model would suffice. Not something that we typically recommend, though.
Is it okay for a wholesaler to put an IDNV contract on a 340B account, or is this best practice?
So an individual contract, I believe is that? Okay, yeah. So an individual contract. Yeah. So it's appropriate for an individual contract to be loaded, as long as that is, of course, meeting all the standards. So you're writing maybe in this case a sub 340B contract that's individual to a specific covered entity. Again, can't be grouped in with other entities and say an IDN. It has to be specific to that entity. But yes, loading those individual contracts is appropriate as long as it is for that specific covered entity.
What recommendation would you have for documenting waste for clinic administered drugs in an F2HD setting? So your process for documenting waste for clinic administered drugs, whether in an F2HD setting or elsewhere, is going to be pretty similar. So if you have a type of drug or a billing mechanism where you are actually billing for waste, that's great, makes your life easier. If not, you do need to rely on manual documentation. We have some templated logs that we've used with some of our clients around that. I think it really depends. It's unfortunately, once you get into the manual processes, it tends to be a much more entity-specific answer. So if you have further questions around how to operationalize that, please feel free to reach out to us. I apologize, there's just not I think a one-size-fits-all once you move into manual processes. Matt, do you have anything else to add?
No, I'd agree. We just need to have another conversation around the specifics of the program, and then we could help kind of design what that needs to look like.
Only the primary contact and the authorizing official have access to the 340B pricing report, which makes it difficult for those who manage the program to look at this information regularly. Do you have information on what other hospitals are doing?
Yeah, so another area that you can get the information from is if you're a member of Apexis in the Prime Vendor Program, when you do the download, the pricing download that has the Apexis pricing in there, they do provide the 340B price. The 340B ceiling price is provided there. And so that typically is able to have, of course, more access. You can register multiple users into Apexis to be able to see that. And so that would be a recommendation, I would say, if your buyers or 340B staff don't have access, that would be something I would do right away, is to say get them access there, and at least they have some visibility through that export. Other than that, yes, the true ceiling price is held pretty tightly with just the two accesses there. But typically, the Apexis file is able to be a good workaround.
All right. For non-covered outpatient drugs set to GPO prohibition, does it matter if there are a lot of negative accumulations under GPO for those items? If so, how do we prevent or fix this? So when you set a drug to automatically purchase GPO, unless of course the WAC price happens to be lower, what happens when you end up with all of those negative GPO accumulations sitting in your accumulator when you run your high-low reports? I think that's what we're getting down into. And at the end of the day, I think that it's because you've set it to GPO only and it falls under your non-covered outpatient drug rule, you don't need to worry about those. They're explainable. What you do want to do is make sure that you're regularly reviewing those and comparing them to your non-covered outpatient drug definition within policy, and make sure that they all align with your policy and that you haven't inadvertently kind of arbitrarily picked GPO only for a random NDC. Other thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, no, I was same lines there. So if that would pop to the top, say a large negative during an audit, it's always great if you're able to go directly over to your NCOD list and show that most of those just one for one line up. And so having that very specific NCOD list, either as part of the policy or part of an appendix to the policy, would be the best way to handle that, and shouldn't be a problem through the audit if that's the case.
Got a little bit of time left. Keep your questions coming. We've got, regarding inventory drug waste, is it safe to assume HRSA supports adding allocated waste back to the accumulator? Is it safe to assume you are using a reverse distributor? You shouldn't be adding a percentage of expired inventory back to the accumulator. I'm going to copy that into chat, Matt.
Okay.
So that you can read it. It's just a lot of words. I can. Or can I, maybe I can assign it to you so you can see it. There we go. Maybe if you go to questions, maybe it'll pop up because I assigned it to you.
Okay. Is it safe?
Okay, so in terms, while you're reading, I'll give my 2 cents. In terms of what HRSA supports or doesn't support, as with many things in this program, there is no specific kind of designation or how to, or you should or you should not do this. But looking back at the kind of drawing back to the statute, that you have to have auditable records tying back to eligible covered outpatient drug dispensations for 340B or inpatient dispensations for GPO. If you are able to tie those back to those utilizations and add them into the accumulator, you are kind of complying with your auditable records and making purchases based on those. The second part around the reverse distributor, Matt, do you want to take that piece?
Yeah, so for the reverse distributor, the fact that you're using a reverse distributor and adding accumulations back is fine. There's not necessarily a connection there. I do think the good thing to do is when you're doing these percentage in terms of what you're returning, to make sure that you're returning those to those accounts, right? So many times your reverse distributor, you may just have one account set up. And so making sure that you have 3 accounts set up, and if you're going to do this allocation model, you know, that you're saying, hey, 30% is going back in this account, 40% on this, or sorry, 60% on this, 10% on the other. That helps keep that kind of balance there in terms of where the credit is coming back to the account. But you know, beyond that, no, there is no issue of using a reverse distributor and adding back into your accumulator.
I got another question about slides and the recording. So just, again, we will be sending out the slides and the recording this week. It will come to the email that you registered for the webinar with. We've got about 5 more minutes. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to put them in here. In response to the large negative GPO question, we set our NDCs to ignore in the CDM mapping tool, which eliminates NCODs going into a negative balance. So that is very, very helpful if having those negative balances becomes a challenge in monitoring your own program. I will say you just want to make sure that you're still reviewing those. So you can do it either way. If you have a bunch of negative accumulations, you want those to be regularly reviewed to make sure that they tie back to your GPO NCOD definition. And if you have them set to ignore, you just want to make sure that you're regularly auditing the drugs that are set to ignore. But a great tip from the audience. Thank you. Anyone else? Euler? All right. Well, it looks like we are kind of tapering off and people are starting to drop out. So we will leave it at this. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. I know it is a hectic time of year, and I'm sure many of you were dealing with mid-year and residency things last week and preparing for vacations in the coming weeks. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules. If other questions come up, please feel free to reach out to either of us or message us on LinkedIn or Twitter. I forgot that's a thing too. But we'd be more than happy to talk about it. So thank you all so much. Anything from you, Matt?
Nope. Thank you, and hope everyone has a great holiday season.
Thank you. Bye.